Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Dan Snyder, and I am delighted to inaugurate this new summer season in both print and live dialogue here. For those who haven't been following along, Comment and this podcast have undertaken a 6-month exploration of social change. What it is, how it happens, what we tend to miss in our impatience for quantifiable results. Where our spring season took a more philosophical approach to these questions, this summer is releasing a little bit more of kind of a scatterplot almanac. Select histories of social movements as they begin in what author and Atlantic Monthly editor Gal Beckerman calls, quote, the quiet before, that fragile ferment of instinct and hope. I am interested in this fertile underground because we live in a time and culture that defaults to celebrity most of the time, even though it yearns for community, and in an age that attends largely to that which is preened in public. We often discount the processes of discernment and trust necessarily nurtured in private. There is a kind of attractive mischief about turning instead toward more hidden beginnings. What exactly is going on when that first trimester is successful, able to mature and birth new life? Is it possible for green shoots to grow on their own terms, not in response to a perceived threat, but rather as an outgrowth of love and a confident vision of the good? With me to affirm that the answer here can be a yes, as much in theory as in a life, is Elizabeth Oldfield, a woman from across the pond whose example in public leadership and private surrender has been no small lodestar in my own attempts to seek and live out the truth of things in vocation and also the household. Elizabeth is a mother, a wife, and much to the interest of this new season, a steward of an intentional Christian community in East London that is as hospitable to the curious as it is doing the very hard work of figuring out what life together in an autonomous urban environment requires and rewards. Elizabeth has a long track record of nurturing intelligent public engagement on issues of spirituality, identity, and healing in our common life. She is the host of widely acclaimed podcast, The Sacred, where she interviews figures in public life about their deepest values and the stories that have shaped them. And for 10 years was the director of Theos think tank, the UK's leading religion and society think tank. We met originally because I caught wind of Elizabeth's announcement that she was stepping down from this position, and I just found the way she did it utterly original. Here's an excerpt from that letter written and published in March of 2021. Quote, "This summer will mark my 10-year anniversary as director of Theos. It will also be the moment I have chosen to step aside and let someone else take on the reins of this precious, much-needed organization. I'm not leaving this job in a way which follows an approved path, namely by jumping into a bigger, flashier role or having an already polished new project to point you to. I am stepping aside because I have led Theos for a decade and believe deeply that healthy organizations should resist becoming too associated with a single person. The mission of Theos to make a case that faith in general and Christianity in particular is a gift, not a threat, a friend, not a foe, especially amongst those least likely to believe this, is very close to my heart, and I am excited to see who shows up to lead it into the next decade. It is a fabulous job, and I've loved every minute." And then this was the key paragraph that really caught my attention. She wrote, "For myself, I feel a strong intuition, in my language, a strong sense from God, that I should resist the pull of status and safety and instead sit for a while and see what emerges. This past year, 2020, has been bruising for many of us, and I want to plot a next season in which I can be as useful and fruitful as possible in a world facing such complex challenges. The longer I am part of, quote, public conversations, the more I think what matters most in life is who we are, what character we are developing, rather than the details of what we do. So I will be attending to my soul and hope to have conversations with many of you as I figure out my next steps." So, like many who read this, as I have come to learn, I was just startled by the vivid freedom in this note, by its maturity and vulnerability. And I was so compelled, I reached out to Elizabeth, then practically a stranger, to thank her for the model of a rather breathtaking trust. Trust in God, trust that not all that is visible and impressive is where value breathes. She kindly responded, and we've since developed a Zoom friendship, a gift that consistently replenishes my own life and outlook. She's coming out with a book whose manuscript I happen to have read recently in nearly one sitting. It was so gripping, titled Fully Alive. And I am very excited to share her contagious joy with you today and just to probe the vagaries of social change as they slide back and forth between the public and private realms. Elizabeth, welcome. I feel so lucky to have borrowed you from your star-spangled podcast studio to be a guest in my own.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's lovely to see you. And the only thing I really lacked there was your wonderful accent on quoting you. So you'll have to bring that full bore. Just pretend you're not talking to a Yankee and be completely proper for us here and show us how English is really spoken.
I'll dial up my Mary Poppins for you.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just start right off the bat. So many different ways we could enter into this conversation, and I frankly chose you quite intentionally to begin what will be this 8-episode series accompanying this second issue on social change at Comment. When you hear this phrase, social change, what sort of is your immediate gut reaction as well as sort of your more intellectual cognitive one?
Yeah, it is a really funny push-pull because I'm both drawn to it and nervous of it. It is social change, I think, is so associated certainly with within the tribes that I got to know most, sort of working in the BBC and in kind of wider activist and social justice tribes, as a kind of laudable goal. But it's also, for other people in other times and places, it's a threat, right? It's a sense of life speeding up in ways we can't control. And so, yeah, my emotional response to it is always from what to what.
Right. We had an interesting dessert of a piece in our spring issue by my colleague, Jeff Reimer, that was a little cheeky. He titled it like in praise of passivism, not pacifism, but with a V. What does it look like to be on the receiving end of vast forces of change that you may not be so keen on all the time? And how do you live? So trying to a little bit ask the question of agency, but in a direction where we often feel we have none.
Yeah. I remember I spoke to Krista Tippett for The Sacred years ago, and her podcast on being circles around a lot of these things. But we were talking about tribalism and how she wants to, and sometimes struggles to get beyond the tribe that is naturally drawn to her kind of work, which grew out of public radio and had a sort of default audience. And she talks about social justice and social change are very coded left. And so she tries and talks about social healing instead, which I imagine their thinking has moved on since I spoke to them. But with all these phrases, thinking about how they land with different people, I think is very helpful. And it's why it's hard to do stuff in short form, because as you do so beautifully, as you did in the introduction, and sort of double clicking on the phrase to see the word cloud around it that we're bringing with us. What are the associations that we're dragging into the conversation or the work that we do, and how much are we actually sharing those with others, and how much do they need translating is especially live in, I think, in that phrase social change right now.
Yeah. In your tenure leading this think tank, Theos, for about a decade, as you look back on it, what do you feel most proud of? What are lessons you would locate as like, we maybe had some false assumptions around the nature of influence and quote, culture change?
And that is absolutely an enormous question. Where to start? Maybe part of the context is that I always felt like a bit of a fraud leading a think tank. Think tanks in the UK I mean, the phrase is very slippery, but is used primarily about policy think tanks, whose theory of change is we will find a social problem, we will write a proposal for what the government should change in their policies in order to fix it. And that was not my formation. I knew how to make radio programs. I knew how to find interviewees. I had done a master's in theology and the arts. I thought about stories. So honestly, goodness knows why they gave me the job. I think that as I came in as a story and communications oriented person, I was very primed that I would learn, how to be a policy person. That was the theory of change that think tanks had to follow. I had this great team I was inheriting. It's not like I had to build anything from scratch, and that we could learn to do really good policy work. But quite early on, it became clear to me that was very much not as clear-cut as I had thought it was. That a lot of think tanks were not doing policy work, and that those that were trying to do policy work, the ability to make that theory of change successful, it is an insanely resource and money and time heavy set of activities. The number of policies that a government actually adopts, puts into legislation, and then rolls out in any continuing way, compared to the amount of policy work that's done, is just like a ridiculous ratio, absolutely ridiculous. Most think tanks will spend a decade pumping out policy proposals and see none of them implemented, right? It depends if your party is in power. It depends if you know the right people. It depends if you have enough money. It's an enormous beast of a way of working. And we were 4 people, and I couldn't see with my pragmatic head on a way of doing it that would actually lead to any kind of success. And it sounded exhausting and disappointing. And at a deeper level than that, I didn't know if we should be. Even if I'd miraculously been able to come up with like £3 million and, balloon the size of the team. When you're a Christian organization, the ability to do good policy work really does depend on you picking a team, because the time it takes to invest in the relationships with a particular party and particular politicians and particular civil servants if you're genuinely trying to be bipartisan and non-partisan at that level, it sort of hamstrings you. So a lot of people make noises about that, but you could easily plot every think tank according to which party they're actually banking on working with.
Right.
And it felt really important to me that if we were trying to present an open and warm and intelligent and curious Christian public presence, it would be absolutely poison if we got too strongly aligned with one party or the other. And so those were the 2 things, really. I thought, I don't think we can do this. I think very few people effectively can. Actually, people pretend they're doing it and they're not. And I don't think we should do this because I think it is bad for our witness. And I don't mean that about all Christian organizations, but for the particular thing we were trying to do, I don't think we should do this. And so quite early on, direct policy work stopped being something that we were focusing on primarily. And this new theory of change emerged about how do we change the cultural atmosphere? How do we hold open space in the public square for the idea that a religious sensibility, a Christian anthropology has much to offer for the common good? And how do we navigate that complex web of culture, those densely networked groups of elites and relationships well? And it became about relationships and stories. We tell a better story about this, a more rigorous, but also a more winsome and a more creative and a more imaginative story about this. And we go and make a bunch of friends, and we work out how to love the people whose ideas are most influential. and be alongside them and be in conversation with them. And that became the kind of blueprint for our theory of change.
I love this phrase that you just used, cultural atmosphere, because I think when a lot of people, both the sort of suspicious of Christian secular folks and ear, and then also quite a few Christians, when they hear the phrase culture change, they often sound like they're talking as engineers, like there's levers you can shift to change people's minds. And it feels, something about it feels like you're forcing, you're prescribing. But this word atmosphere is a very sociological term. It's beautifully soft, and it's getting at the conditions. There is something about the role of patience and time, safety, aesthetics, words, and tonality that shift the way in which people feel safe to actually explore what is true, or feel like they might open up their mind to take a totally different policy position and actually hear one another. And all of this is not manipulative, but it is looking at the more subtle terrain. It's really the gardening metaphor more than it is like a war plan.
Yeah, very much so. And the report that we did just before I left called Breaking Ground, which had echoes with the Breaking Ground project that we were also part of with you guys, and you guys ran in comment, really, I think, consolidated a lot of the thinking that we'd done over those 10 years, that attempting to think about how culture and how it changes and wanting to be a redemptive presence in it humbles you immediately, because you're like, oh, wow, the number of variables in this and how little we can control in this. You know, John Paul Lederach talks about not critical mass, but critical yeast. Like, what does it mean to be critical yeast? What does it mean to be enough of a savvy and wise and thoughtful presence that you can, do your very best to create the conditions where that yeast can spread and grow. But ultimately, some of those loaves are going to fall flat. That humility that gardening teaches you, that so you'll plant some seeds and they won't come up. You know, you'll have to wait a year to know if my mushroom bed is the spores are gonna survive and my oyster mushrooms are gonna come up. You know, that the war metaphors really get us in trouble, I think, and the like strategy control metaphors really get us in trouble. Not least because I don't think they're scriptural, and I don't think they are. How we comport ourselves as individuals and organizations, and the virtues that we're growing into and the vices that we're compromising with because they're useful to us, is as much the imprint that we will leave through our work as the activities we actually do. And so that became a big part of our thinking as well. What are our relationships like internally? Are we actually healthy? Are we personally healthy? Are we healthy, and are we growing in faith, hope, and love? And then we might have a chance of saying something in the world which is just not going to do more harm than good. For whatever reason, I had this real strong sense of it's very easy to do more harm than good. Sometimes nothing is better than something.
Yes. The presence we emit is as, if not more important than the actions or even the words. And I think that's especially true in community form and organizational form. So I'd love to share with listeners a little bit your life now and how you got there. When I think about it, having gotten to know you the last year or so, it actually feels like the just a continuation of the same thread of how you wound up stewarding and shaping Theos over your tenure there. The shift to stories and cultivating an atmosphere and what sort of true Christian presence actually means. So to me, it all feels like there's such integrity and continuity. Could you tell us a bit what you're inhabiting now and what the journey was to choosing this somewhat radical way of life for East London?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it does feel like there's continuity to me. I feel very grateful to have quite early on had a deep sense of my values and my vocation, and then just been following the thread. And often I'd be like, really? This is what we're doing next? Well, that's unusual, but okay. That I was speaking to a friend the other day of like surrendering to being downwardly mobile in the world's terms, and that being where my sacred values have led me. And that is both very scary for my ego and security, and also very liberatory, because you can sort of call bull on the story that we were all up and to the right anyway, and that was where fulfillment and satisfaction lies. So so I have always known that I am cool, that communication is one of the sort of tools in my toolbox, and that speaking about both my faith, but also just the deeper things of what do we think a person is, and how do we love each other well, and what actually is worth doing with a life, what is a good worth orienting ourselves towards. That part of what I was supposed to be doing with my life was around that. And so that was what I was trying to do at the BBC. That was what I was trying to do at Theos. And as I came out of Theos, I was very burnt out, I should say. Like the key thing that I felt led to was rest. And I thought I'd be fine at it because I'm not actually I'm not driven in that sense. I am pretty good at boundaries. I really like rest. I'm not addicted to work. I never have been. And so I was like, oh yeah, fine, great, rest. And then got there and realized that it was so much harder than it looked. Just stopping and being in my garden. And after 10 years of raising 2 young kids and growing an organization, I didn't know how to shift down through the gears. It just didn't. And so it must be much worse if you are someone who is pretty driven. So yeah, I rested eventually after like one big, very painful breakthrough session with my spiritual director. It was a question of obedience. I was like, what's God said? He said, rest. Are you resting? No, I don't know how to do that. And it was like, what if everyone forgets me? What if I never get a job again? What if I'm no use in the world? Is this just retreat? Is this just surrender? Am I just giving up? The world is in such a mess. How can this possibly be of any use? But it was. And during that time, my husband and I were moving into intentional community. So it really has been a big focus of my life over the last 2 years, is this dream of a space of hospitality, a space of resilience, a space of welcome. And so we now live with one other family full time, and then we have 2 guest rooms where people stay with us. We shop together and we eat together, and we've turned the garage into a chapel, and we pray together. And we are discipling each other at a very deep level. It's incredibly intimate and vulnerable. And we are finding that through seeking that life in community together, many people are drawn to it, and people who might not have expected to are interested in what's driving us, and they have questions about God and questions about spirituality and questions about the world. And in a very informal way, without the structures of a think tank or a university or a mad cultural change program, the same themes are there. Let's build some relationships. Let's tell some better stories. Let's seek to live in ways that feel more humane.
So you've been living in this house with this other family in a very hospitable way for 14 months, 16 months?
In this house, which is an extraordinary thing that we've been able to buy it, and we've been able to buy it together, but with also some people who have invested in it. So there's a kind of financial and legal model that we're developing, but we had rented together first because we couldn't afford to buy it at that stage. We could barely afford to rent together. And also it felt like a sensible thing before you get a joint mortgage with someone to know if you can actually live together.
I'm wondering, when I hear, ever since I've heard you describe this, and I'm sure hundreds of people who have both sat around your table, prayed in that garage, but also just have heard about it from your lips, hear this and think, this is the church. Like, this is like Jesus's disciples replicating just 20 plus centuries later. And this is in some ways a very constant thread throughout Christian history in particular, that this sort of thing with variations, the monastic tradition is one and a Baptist community is another, certain movements in the 1960s and 70s, this sort of thing has bubbled up at various moments, sometimes in more movement forms, sometimes just in very a la carte, solitary candle ways. And you're doing it in what I understand to be a very diverse neighborhood in East London and obviously urban context. Does it feel just that, like this is just mustard seed kingdom-y, like experiment that will always be what it smells and feels like to actually be living this out with others 1,000 years from now, 1,000 years before now? Or does it also feel somehow particularly needed today, because a lot of the background institutions that would have perhaps given many of us more a sense of communion and commonality or common life have eroded and been displaced by technology? Does it feel like very timely of this moment and called forth in this moment? Or just like, this is just obedience to 2,000 years of and beyond that, also the Jewish tradition, like a strange group of people valuing the table and rituals and sharing possessions and life in common?
Yeah, definitely both.
Yeah.
So I think it is something that Christians have often felt called to, because it's hard to walk the narrow way, right? It's hard to hold to the love that tells us to love our neighbor and to give away a lot of what we own. And none of that comes naturally to me. So I want help. I want scaffolding. I want structure. I want accountability. And the congregations give us some of that. But in the way most of us do congregations, it's too ephemeral, the contacts we have with people, to get to that level of knowing how we're growing and what we're doing and how we're living. It feels like we were pushed into it right now because we couldn't afford to stay in the city, and we felt very called to the city from nowhere. I remember I come from the woods. I am a woman of the trees. I remember literally saying to a Tim Keller sermon about the value of committing to the city, like, go away, Tim Keller. I am not the kind of person that's going to stay in the city. Like, stop it. About 2 years before, I felt this incredibly strong sense of call. It's like, fine, we'll stay in the city. But we couldn't, because we had a 2-bedroom flat and 2 small children, and it wasn't conducive, and it gave us a very tiny and very privileged sense of the pressures on so many of us. And we sometimes talk about like triple crises. We have a housing crisis. It's mad where we live. It's really very, very undermining of individual and family lives that there is not enough housing that is stable and safe. People are dying because there is mold on their walls. It is home is a very difficult thing to find where we live anyway. There's a loneliness crisis. There's neither enough houses for us, but also we are not with each other, is of the very strange paradox of the way we live. We don't know each other. We don't spend time together. It's difficult to care for each other. All of the natural points of overlap and congregation and meeting are being slowly eroded by these technologized forms of comfort and convenience, which just dehumanize the fabric of our society. And we have a climate crisis. And honestly, that's the livest thing for me right now. We are in very deep trouble. And I don't know, I'm not in the position to be enacting the kind of change that is required. And I'm increasingly unsure whether we can enact the kind of change that is required. And so the deeper, older thing of, okay, Christians have lived through the plague of Cyprian. Christians have lived through the Black Death. Christians have lived through the fall of Rome. Christians, like the Trente Glorieuses, the like post-war stability and prosperity that, let's be clear, the West and only some people in the West have experienced, but certainly my generation was that was the cultural atmosphere. is the exception, not the rule, for how disciples have lived. And so surrendering to, we might be in the time where that is ending, and more will be asked of us in a world where, frankly, our sin has harmed our home. I want to do that with other people. Like, honestly, Anne, on my worst days, I go full prepper. I'm like, this is why I'm learning to grow food. How do I learn how to do basic medicine? How many kilograms of lentils do I need if we have to feed our street?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to hold steady enough to be my roots deep enough into the love of God, and to be in an interdependent, trusting, vulnerable community with enough capacity and skill and hopefulness to be a place of refuge for others in times of emergency, rather than just contributing to the emergency,
right?
Which I fear would be my natural character.
Yeah. Do you think that if you were back in sort of some more policy adjacent, policy influencing, more kind of large scale, or at least attempting to be large scale cultural atmosphere shifting, narrative change work that had infrastructure around you, specifically around the climate crisis, that you would feel somehow more satisfied in your level of agency and contribution to help solve the problem? Or no, do you think in some ways you're exactly where you need to be right now, and all that you just described is at the heart? I think not attending to what you are now attending to is part of why we have so unraveled ecologically.
Yeah, the second one.
Okay.
Because I know people who are still there, like giving their bodies to try and haul those levers of change that are not, it appears, haulable.
Yeah.
And I think every time I meet someone who's working on that, I just want to like give them a hug and cook them a meal and say thank you and say like, where is your support?
Yeah.
But the skills that you need to do that work well were not the skills that I was given. That is not my temperament. Like it, and the weight that is on those people who are on the front lines is too heavy for them. And so, yes, like I will do my showing up at a march and writing to my MP and trying to work out what changes we can make in our lives that are actually of any use. But the thing I feel called to right now is, okay, if we can't turn this boat around, if we have so surrendered to a kind of modernist machine, this extractive posture to the world, this pride and our greedy addiction to comfort and convenience, if we are too far down this path to know how to turn us back, what kind of people are we going to need? Like what, as it cracks, you know, as things fall apart, and they might not, but for whatever reason, this is what I'm sitting with. As this falls apart, what will we need? And we will need shelter, and we will need communities that know and love each other, because individualism is sod all use in a crisis. And we will need people, we will need our ancestral skills. I will need to learn how to grow food, you know?
Yeah.
The hyper real, maybe we can fix this with technologized solutions, but that slightly feels like trying to bring down the master's house with the master's tools, you know? It's just like I don't know how that happens. And so the thing that I am surrendering to, and I hope it's an engaged surrender, not a passive surrender, is I need to get out of a panic and clenched fight or flight response to the trouble the world is in. And I need to grieve. I need to move past bargaining, frankly. My recycling is not going to save the world. And I need to come to a place where I am steadied enough, where I can look around me and see what are the needs that need meeting here, and what are the tools that we will need, and what are the skills that we will need, and what will it mean to love our neighbor in 5 years' time. And how do I become the kind of person that can love my neighbor in 5 years' time and 10 years' time and 15 years' time? There's a great Wendell Berry poem, which it's going round and round in my head at the moment, called The Mad Farmer's Liberation Front. And the phrase from it is, expect the end of the world, laugh, be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. And that is the thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if that's hard. Talking about this stuff is hard.
No, it's hard. It's really real. Thank you. I'm very curious to know if there have been active and believable attempts amongst those exposed to how you're living who are pursuing doing the same, even somewhat near you, like in your own neighborhood. Like, do you see at all any hint of village creation here yet?
Not yet. I think I'm hoping we're in that first trimester, as we were talking about. I'm hoping we're in the quiet before, because it was always when our housemates and my husband and I felt this sort of growing sense of hunger and vision for this. It was for three reasons. It was for this kind of like pragmatic and practical response to a twin set of crises. How we're living is not working. How do we live differently? It was for theological reasons around discipleship and witness. Mm-hmm. And then it was for this related thing of, we think this might not just be healthier and more humane for us, but for other people as well. And we did a lot of research, we visited a lot of other communities, and almost all of them are exactly what you said about the lone candle. And what they said to us is, it's so exhausting hacking your way through the pre-existing systems to live differently. Like in our case, it was illegal to rent together because there's some legislation called the Houses of Multiple Occupation legislation that makes that difficult. It was hard to get a mortgage together because there's only so many mortgage companies that do that. Like, there's structural barriers, and then there's emotional barriers. There's all these stories we're told about what home should be and our own space. And what if you get annoyed with someone in your home? How will you cope with that? There's just like multiple ways in which our formation does not prepare us to live in community. And everyone we visited said, by the time you've hacked the way through that and actually managed to get into community together, because it was like a 3-year lead up, life takes over and you're just maintaining what you've got. And so please, would you guys be the people who take what is learned and disseminate it? So we heard that and we were like, yeah, sure. And one of my housemates has an MBA, and he thinks about like social business and social projects. And he has a particular thing on his heart about, how do we make this accessible? How do we make this replicable? But honestly, and where we are right now is, we've spent 6 months in exactly where everyone said we would, which was exhausted from getting to the process of actually managing to get here. And then needing to build walls and needing to get new windows and worrying if we were subsiding and dealing with our arguments and welcoming 200 people around our table and to the chapel, which is beautiful and part of the heart of things. You know, it's been a really amazing time. But the bit about how do we make this easier for other people is our kind of next season thing. How do we capture what we've learned and disseminate it? How do we say, the hope is that we will have some sort of course or resource that says, this is the hard stuff. This is where the legal and the financial stuff comes up. This is how the legislation plays out here. This is what you need to know. Like, these are the different models you can use of connecting your lives or not, sharing money or not. Think about your exit points. We have a very detailed document about what happens if someone dies, what happens if someone gets divorced, what happens when probably one of us wants to leave and the other ones don't. How do we make that as easy as possible? But then the soft stuff, what conversations do you need to have? How do you make sure you're aligned in values? What is your vision? How do you deal with conflict? What's the rhythm of life? What's the rule of life that your community wants in order to scaffold and structure the vision when so much of life will start destabilizing it quite quickly? And so part of my response to your question is slightly guilty that we've not done more yet, but there is a definite hope because we're going to need it.
Yeah.
We're definitely going to need this.
Yeah, no, I think the world, especially those in the West, will very much need this. And I just want to play devil's advocate. Are you sure you need to codify it into sort of more like a toolkit, like an open source toolkit? Do you need to sort of institutionalize what you're doing? Or could it just be presence and presence and presence? And then, I know this is not scalable, but conversations with those who want to try and then apply in their own way.
That's a helpful challenge. I mean, temperamentally, I would always want to just do conversations. The thing I try and hear from people who think about social change differently is kind of lower the barriers to entry. And one of the ways you can lower the barriers to entry is giving people at least a start here type thing.
Yes. Yeah.
We're already in that informal way, I'm already talking and writing about what we're doing, and people are coming and we are sharing what we've learnt. But I certainly think a kind of whatever conclusions you come to, these are the questions you need to ask. How there's various scales on which communities can sit.
Yeah.
Make sure and that everyone is on the same page, because that can be a real problem.
Yes, even in a marriage. That's
yes,
just two
indeed.
people.
Honestly, there's a line from one of the books that we use that says starting a community with someone is like marrying them and starting a business with them at the same time, and it really is.
One thing I think about you raising children in this context, and I love how it feels like there's such a coherence, kind of almost like a moral coherence because of the shared rituals and like so much shared between right now two families inside these walls. And yet you're very porous. You do have people over every week there, and I would love to know even how word spreads, the dinners are happening and how that all works. But especially with children in the house coming into their own, how do you think about the risks and the exposure? Could you talk about the underside? And the call to be porous and the joy of that and the way it enriches you, but also I can't imagine it's always a settled story.
No, very much not. And I'm the like non-rosy tinted spectacle member of the community. So I'm always thinking in terms of risk, and the children were our biggest risk. It's a reason there's very few people who do this at our stage of life. It's very common in your 20s, whether you're talking about religious forms of intentional community or others, ecological or others. You get lots of clustering in the period where people are very free. And then again, when people are in their 50s and 60s. But like the slog middle years of high responsibility, especially if you have children, it's just there aren't that many models. There weren't that many people doing it that we could find. People that do it tend to do it in more of a co-housing version than we have. So separate family space and then some shared space. Whereas we are nominally the top floor is our housemate's floor and the second floor is our floor. But the bathroom's on the top floor, like there's a little bit of distance. There's no door. And so it was my biggest fear. And I think it was my biggest fear that we would, like, let's be direct, like that we would accidentally expose our children to abuse, right? It is easier. Children are more vulnerable in houses with more people in them who are not members of their family. I mean, sometimes they're vulnerable to members of their family too. But there are reasons why these kind of radical experiments can end in dysfunction. I think they can be both much more healthy and much more humane than the kind of hutch type nuclear family model we use. And they can be much less healthy and much less humane. And so we have had probably more conversations about that than anything else. We did a good year and a half of due diligence on our housemates before I was like, okay, I trust the bones of you. I will bring you into a house, bringing you into my kids' lives at this level. We have a lot of people here for dinner and during the daytime. People who are overnight guests, we need to know. Mm-hmm. And they are on a different floor from the kids. And our calling is I think there's a great book called Tobias Jones, by Tobias Jones, called A Place of Refuge. And they did an intentional community in the woods with kids with a particular calling to those struggling with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And our particular charism is not to those with extra vulnerabilities like that. It is to people who have a kind of intellectual or spiritual quest going on.
Yeah.
And so I think that makes it easier. But the line between safeguarding and hospitality is one that is constantly being negotiated and renegotiated. And it means if we didn't have kids, we would be doing this very differently. And then I think, as well as having very connected lives with our housemates, we have one night a week where it's just Oldfield family dinner, and that's pretty sacrosanct. And then we make sure that we're having enough holidays and weekends that are just the four of us. And we make sure we have one-on-one time with each parent and each child. And very regularly, we are asking, how is this going? Do you like living like this? What's hard? What's good?
Mm-hmm.
And at the point where it's not good for them, we will leave.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that honesty, Elizabeth. So let's head towards home base here by talking a bit about your book. I'd just love to tell our listeners about it. I absolutely loved it. As you know, just the manuscript, I'm sure you're tweaking a lot of things here or there, but tell us why you wrote it and what its general hope is and how it kind of integrates with your very life now.
Thank you. Gosh, this is the first time I've spoken about it in public because it's won't be out till next May. So it's still
in the quiet before.
Yeah, it's in the quiet before where it's very live for me, but not yet accessible. It's called Fully Alive. We're still working on the subtitle. And it is a series of personal essays loosely structured around the 7 deadly sins, but really as a way of writing about theological ideas for mainstream readers. So my bugbear all the way through, right since I was making programs on the BBC, is my experience of Christianity and how rich and complex and satisfying and liberatory these ideas and these communities are. The gap between that and my lived experience and the public narratives is just cavernous and very, very annoying. You know, I say somewhere in the book, like, we're led to believe that it will be like oily Easter egg chocolate, you know, and primary colors, cartoons for children. And instead it's like a Caravaggio or a complex red wine, right? Even just at the aesthetic level.
Yeah.
And so I am trying to write a bit more about the Caravaggio and the red wine. I'm trying to say this is, and again, particularly now, and I'm very aware that every generation sort of thinks the world is ending, right? That every generation thinks that their crisis is the last crisis, and maybe it's just the narcissism of millennials. But that I think it is a sort of evidenceable to say we feel destabilized, that the world does not feel especially safe, that we don't know what the future holds. And the inheritance of our ancestors in terms of how to think about who we are and what makes a life worth living and what kind of people do we want to be has been dropped somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
And instead, we are mainly taught how to be hot and successful. And I don't think any of us really think that's what's going to make us happy, but there's very few alternatives. So
yeah,
I am trying to put theological wisdom and the thinking of 2,000 years of tradition back in the hands of people who would currently not walk into a church or feel comfortable listening to a sermon, but really are hungry for wisdom, really are hungry for ways to settle their souls, are asking all the same questions. That's who I want to be able to write for, to be a blessing for.
Well, I, who feel in my own way, try to do something very similar in a slightly different context, an American, more civil religious context than the UK. But I personally found the book like very convicting in the best possible way. So it's one of those, I don't say this lightly. I think it's one of those, like, if not life shapers, if not life changers, life shapers, but I found it like quite life changing if you actually take it seriously. So thank you. I mean that.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking courage and being your own voice. Elizabeth, you're a treasure. There's so many more threads we could go down, but is there any last word of a thought bubble or a line of encouragement to all those who do feel troubled by the turbulence of the moment, that you could say, not as a pat answer, but just kind of the grace of your own days and learning that you'd like to sprinkle outward?
Thanks. It's definitely not my own learning, but I would say reading Wendell Berry really helps me. Reading poetry in general, learning to garden. The narrow way seems to me to be the way between despair and denial. I don't think that everything is going to be okay, but everything was never going to be okay in this dark world, right? That the story that if we're a Christian, we locate ourselves in should make turbulence something to be expected. And if we can get out of our fight or flight response to it and our immediate fears for ourselves and our children, then there is such deep treasure and wisdom in that story and in the people that have walked this path before to help us navigate it. Actually, the weird thing at the moment, Anne, is what I'm aware of is in the cracking of the systems and in the turbulence, what it might force us to do is to become more like the people we're supposed to be anyway.
Yeah.
And that the ways that this season, this sort of artificial decade of prosperity and comfort and convenience for those of us who had access to it, has formed us in some really unhelpful ways. And things that force us back together and force us back to the earth and force us to our knees might be gifts as well as threats.
Amen. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes, a great prayer. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution. We are officially back after a break since our spring season covering all things social change. But it shouldn't feel all that long ago, as this season is continuing the conversation by diving in to the real-life hopes and tensions faced by those contemporary upstarts today who are intentionally going outside the status quo values of scale and systems to more discrete levers and creative embodiments. We hope you will be sufficiently intrigued that you'll toggle over from this podcast to our summer issue at www.comment.org, where you'll find a more historical take in the same vein. We are in the business of fostering an imagination for a thriving society animated by the Christian humanist tradition. Comment publishes pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. The Welcome Table is hosted by Greg Thompson. Zealots at the Gate is a feisty podcast about religion and democracy featuring Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig, and a whole lot more. We are also blooming into a real-time hub of conversation made up of writers, readers, civic leaders, and community weavers. We'd love for you to participate in that conversation and help us grow. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.